Baltimore and WNST. I got to admit, I think I've had just about everybody on my program over the course of time that I wanted to have on. This is a guy I've been chasing, if not stalking, in recent years to try to get him on the show. And, I thought one day Steve Rushin's going to write a book. And when he writes the book, he's going to want to sell the book. And when he wants to sell the book, he's going to come on. And I'm going to get to talk sports with one of my favorite sports writers. It is our first visit ever, although I have watched his life and wife and children and writing and Sports Illustrated's come and go. The new book is Stingray Afternoons, and finally, Steve Rushin has come to Baltimore to be a part of this program. What's going on, man?
Well, Nestor, I thought you were going to say you've interviewed everybody you wanted to on the show, and now you're turning to people you didn't want to have on the show.
No. There's you and Bono, maybe Jagger. That's about it.
Steve Bono, yeah. I'm doing well, man. Thanks. I've got the book out. It's about a memoir of my growing up in the 1970s, but it's really a memoir of just being a kid. So whether you grew up in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s or the 40s, everybody was a kid once, so I think they'll recognize themselves somewhere in the book. Well,
man, you and I are almost the same age. You got me by a couple of years, but I kind of came into the business the same time you did. I was at the Baltimore Sun. You were off running around doing the journalism thing and wound up at Sports Illustrated very early on. And, I mean, your story about basketball and getting your gig, and everybody that hasn't read, where you came from, and you have this incredible story, but writing memoirs, man, that's something that I think a lot of us are doing more of now in the era of Facebook and Twitter, where we can share little independent memories or a blog that reminds us of something. There is a format for that in a way that being an author at Sports Illustrated, you couldn't. But I don't know at what point the light comes on to say, all right, 50, that's the time to pour out my childhood, right? I mean, what made this the right time for you? Because you went away from like columns and were doing like novel type stuff for a while, right?
Well, it wasn't a matter of sitting down and saying this is the right time to do it. Obviously, athletes write their memoirs when they're 19. Some guys are 15 years old and won a couple tennis matches, and they write their memoir. What happened for me was I sat down one day, as I think many people have done, and said, and looked at a newspaper from the day that I was born, September 22nd, 1966. And I mean, you talk about it being a completely different time. 400 fans came to Yankee Stadium that night for the White Sox-Yankee game. There were fewer than 1,000 fans at Wrigley Field for the Cubs game. The pennant races were winding down. There were no divisions in baseball. So once you were out of it, out of the race to win the pennant, your season was pretty much over, and fans stopped coming. I looked, a six-pack of old style was like 79 cents. Star Trek was on that night, the third ever episode, but it was the episode that really people think of as the pilot episode, introducing Spock and Kirk, and it got me thinking. What was that night like that I was born? I was born at 6:45 in the evening. Was Star Trek on in the waiting room as my dad was pacing? Fathers weren't allowed in the delivery room, and I looked at the next day's paper, and then I looked at the next day's paper, and I started thinking about what those years of life before your memory kicks in. I have little kids. And, they're not going to remember what happened when they were 2 or 3 years old. Memory kind of kicks in after that. So I started looking at those years, and then I just kept going, and I fell down the rabbit hole. And before I knew it, I was writing a memoir of growing up in the 70s. I was 3 when the 70s started. I was 13 when they ended. So kind of those prime years of childhood from, the onset of memory to the onslaught of puberty, the most innocent years of being a kid. And the book's called Stingray Afternoons because, we spent our days on our muscle bikes, Schwinn Stingrays. In my case, I had a CCM Mustang Marauder, and just killing hours on end with 5 TV channels and an order not to come home until dinner time.
Well, and you grew up in a sports environment, right? I mean, you grew up in Bloomington, Minnesota, which is now famously took a stadium and turned it into a mall, and everybody will be visiting it next year for the Super Bowl, as will I. But there was a lot of sports around for you, right? But also different with hockey and cold weather and outdoor football and Fran Tarkington and Tony Oliva and all of that stuff. But not probably too dissimilar to my thoughts of running around Memorial Stadium with the Orioles and the Colts in the late 70s.
Absolutely. It's what I imagine life must have been like growing up in L.A., at the time. And I spent a lot of time imagining what it would have been like to grow up in L.A. and just, be able to see the Brady Bunch house and oh my gosh, there's Danny Partridge and that kind of thing. There's the Little League field where Bad News Bears was filmed. For me, it was kind of a sports version of that. So
can I ask you? The Bad News Bears changed my life, right? So, I mean, I'm a baseball family. My cousin's in the Hall of Fame, all that. I don't remember not having a bat and a glove and a wiffle ball as a kid. But there really was something about the Bad News Bears. I was 7 or 8 when it came out. I'm guessing you were 9 or 10 or 11 in that range. We did not have an outfield fence in my Little League. To this day, I still feel really scarred about that, Steve. Like, I feel like if you had an outfield fence that you could actually hit a real home run, not one that like the ball rolled out and they kicked it around. We didn't have that opportunity as a kid. I feel cheated, man.
It was unbelievable. Everything that was on TV or the movies was so much cooler. It was like when you were a kid, and you went to somebody else's house and they had Risk, or they had, an orange It's a Ball. They had something that you didn't have, then that was the greatest place ever. Even now, kids come over to our house and look at these toys. My kids haven't played with those toys in forever. And they go to somebody else's house and they can't believe what a better bunch of stuff that they have. Well, you're absolutely right about the Bad News Bears field. Having a fence was an amazing thing. Having dugouts, because we had, aluminum benches or you just sat in the bleachers.
We definitely had jerk parents as managers on the other team. Everybody had that, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But what we didn't have, and I watched that movie recently, and it's pretty startling to watch 40 years later for a number of reasons. But one thing that we didn't have, even in the league championship game, the climactic game, spoiler alert, the Bad News Bears make it to the championship. There's a handful of parents in the stands. There were no parents attending practices and staying for practice. I don't really remember caring whether or not my parents were at my Little League games, and oftentimes they weren't. And one thing that they had dead on, that is perfect, period, Little League baseball at the time, is the kids wore their regular pants, jeans, or even, like plaid slacks to their games and practice. So you got a T-shirt and a hat. And later they got uniforms, but I have all kinds of team photos of me on one knee in plaid Farrah dress pants and like a T-shirt that says Tigers on it.
Were you a Kelly Leak or were you more like an Ogilvy?
Oh God, I was much more of an Ogilvy. I got my front teeth knocked out at a practice when I forgot to bring my hat, and I was playing first base, and the coach was laying down. He was hitting infield, and you throw it to first base after you fielded it. But I didn't know he was going to lay one down for the catcher, a bunt, and the catcher picked it up. I was daydreaming and looking directly into the sun. Sun was setting behind the catcher. He threw it. I didn't even see it coming. It hit me in the teeth, knocked my teeth out. And needless to say, I went into baseball writing instead of baseball playing. That was probably a hint.
He is Steve Rushin. No one writes about sports better than he does at Sports Illustrated for many, many years. The book is Stingray Afternoons, a memoir. You can find it pretty much anywhere books are sold. And, of course, you can follow Steve out on Twitter, as tens of thousands do, at Steve Rushin. And, but what a life, right? I mean, honestly, for both of us. I've owned a radio station for 20 years. All I've ever done with my life is write and talk about sports. I can't imagine that you and I, as 8, 9, 10-year-old kids in the late 70s, during the baseball strike of 81, when I'm sure both of our dads were equally pissed, that we would make a life of this and that sports would become what it's become in this way. It really is kind of incredible, right?
Oh, it's unbelievable. And I had the perspective warping experience of working at Twins and Vikings games when I was 13 years old, 14 and 15, the last 3 years of Metropolitan Stadium in Bloomington, the last time they played outdoors before they moved back into Target Field. And I remember distinctly thinking at the time that at some point I got to get a grown-up job. It will never be this good again. I got paid to attend those games. I worked in the commissary that made the food for the vendors. It was just like a Lord of the Flies situation. They'd lock kids in the walk-in meat freezer just for laughs. Who could survive the longest? But at the end of
at least you had hot dogs in there, right? I mean,
you had hot dogs. You had snow cones. You had Frosty Malts. I mean, it was like you were locked in.
There was sustenance in there if you could hang with the temperature. Hell, you live in Minnesota. It's colder outside than it is in a freezer.
And you knew in the back of your mind that they weren't going to kill you, that this was still a place of work. And then you got to watch the 7th, 8th, and 9th innings of the games because you were done at the top of the 7th. So I had this feeling then that, at some point I'm going to have to get a real job. I'm not going to be able to get paid to watch ball games. And now I'm 50, and I have yet to have to get that real job. So I feel super lucky, and that kind of wanting to just loaf around ballparks was instilled in me very early.
So every musician probably gets asked, what their favorite song is, or what's the best song they ever wrote, or whatever. But you've written a number of books now. What makes this one more special than the others?
Well, I love them all, and I have, they always say, you don't love any one of your kids more than the other, but the thing about this book was I spent my career as a sports writer trying to make sense of other people's lives. You go out and write a feature story on somebody, some athlete with a totally chaotic life, and your job is to impose this narrative on it and try to make sense of his or her life when he or she can't make sense of their own life. So it's kind of oftentimes an artificial act where let's make a story out of this chaos that is life. And for me, it was fun to sit down and try to make sense of my own life and impose this narrative on my own life. So, part of it was, and, I wrote a novel, The Pint Man, that I wrote almost entirely while lying or propped up on a couch in my office. And it had sort of the experience of being on a psychologist's couch. I think this was a little bit of the same thing. I got to try to figure out what the hell my life is about, has been about, and I also have kids, so it was interesting to see, have them come home from school and talk about something that happened at school, or just see them being, in the case of my son, 8 years old, and it put me in the shoes of what it was like to be 8 years old, what it smelled like, what it sounded like, what it felt like, because I didn't want to write a book that was just about that great family vacation, that time I got a hit in Little League. So much childhood was A, terrifying, and I had a great childhood, or B, super boring, where you have 8 hours of a summer day before you and nothing to do but bash a tennis ball against a brick wall.
Dude, isn't that what Napoleon Dynamite, isn't that what made Napoleon Dynamite so great, is that we all hit a tetherball and hit it back. We were all rode our bike with no one looking for someone, right? And that's everyone's experience in the world.
Absolutely. And in my case, I had a brother who was a year older than I am, and I was always trying to tag along with him. And at some point, and it was, in my memory, much earlier than I wished it was, he was riding his bike. We'd ride our bikes together down the driveway, and before long, he was riding a lot faster than I was, and he was disappearing out of sight. And I really do believe that one of the reasons I became a writer is we're comfortable in our own solitude. We have to be. And I had to become comfortable in my own solitude. I was one of 5 kids, but I spent a lot of time alone, and I think it helps A, your imagination, and B, it helps you kind of be introspective. So, you talk about Napoleon Dynamite and the tetherball. It wasn't a bad thing, You could sort of be mesmerized by a tetherball for quite some time,
I can't tell how many times I stood with a tennis racket against the wall with a ball and played tennis with myself because there weren't other kids in my neighborhood that knew how to play tennis. I mean, literally.
Right. Absolutely. And I don't want to go on a these kids today rant. I'm not like that at all. But so much of today's activities, at least for my children and the kids in this area, I live in New England, is an organized, adult-supervised, you pay a fee, they get a T-shirt, they're all together in a group, and some grown-up is kind of telling them what to do. They're not getting together on the street and making up a game. My buddy Kevin and I, we'd throw a tennis ball against the garage door, and one was a pitcher, one would try to hit the ball, and if he hit it over across the street to the Johnson's house, it was a single. If he hit their house...
Did you spray paint the strike zone behind it on the wall? We did that.
The garage door was so filthy that it would have been covered up immediately. And I always say there are two kinds of parents, the kind of parents that let you destroy the garage door and the kind that don't. And I was lucky, and Kevin was lucky, in that we had parents who didn't care what the hell we did to our garage.
We'll paint the damn thing later. I mean, let the kids be kids. They're playing ball out there. Just no ball in the house. We all had that rule, right?
Harmon Killebrew's mother said, complained that Harmon and his brother were destroying the lawn playing baseball, and Harmon Killebrew's father famously said, "We can raise boys or we can raise grass, but we can't raise both." And I was lucky in that my parents were more interested in raising kids than raising grass.
He is Steve Rushin. He is one of my all-time favorite sports writers. This is his first ever visit. He is visiting because he has a book that he hopes you buy, and I hope you buy it too. Stingray Afternoons, a memoir. You can find it. You can find Steve Rushin out on Twitter. All right, so backtracking into Harmon Killebrew, I'm coming to Minnesota a couple times this year. The Ravens play the Vikings out there in the new Glass Menagerie, and then, of course, the Super Bowl is going to be there. So I'm going to be freezing my ass off for about 10 or 11 days like I did back in '92. And the Mets Stadium thing. I did 30 ballparks in 30 days 2 summers ago for the Bone Marrow Registry, and as part of that, I obviously went to Target Field, which is lovely and wonderful, and the cheeseburgers are good, and the local beer, it's nice, all the statues. But the Mets Stadium site, I mean, when I drive down 33rd Street near Memorial Stadium, or what used to be, Steve, my heart breaks a little bit. There's a little teardrop. You have had this mall and the Harmon Killebrew baseball up on the wall next to the roller coaster in the middle of this fun zone. It's a little weird when they rip your stadium down from your childhood, right? I mean, we all weep for that a little bit, don't we?
Absolutely, and the mall that they built the most kind of ridiculous, cartoonish caricature of kind of modern society, quote unquote, progress that they could possibly have done. They tore down a ballpark and put in its place the nation's largest shopping mall, which is a metaphor for so many things, but it remains on Killebrew Drive. They still have home plate from the Met embedded there in what was the Camp Snoopy amusement park. It's something else now.
When you take your kids there for a day, does it feel like home to you? I mean, does it piss you off, or does it?
I was there last week on vacation. We go back over the 4th of July every year, and we had a few hours to kill before we were heading to the airport. And my kids asked if we could go to the Mall of America. I said, no, we couldn't. We didn't have time, and I just had no interest. No, of course it does. And in your case, I completely understand, the feelings you have, but they replaced Memorial with Camden Yards. Here, they tore this place down and moved into the Metrodome, which was so bad, didn't have air conditioning that first year. People forget that. It was so cheap that they actually put a sign on the vinyl down the right field line that everybody in Minnesota remembers that said, "The Metrodome, Minneapolis, we like it here." And somebody actually sent me that picture on Twitter the other day. We like it here. Like, we don't care what you think of us. We like it here, gosh darn it. You don't have to come. And so we had, 25 years or whatever it was of that dump. And before they did the right thing and moved back outdoors into Target Field, which is gorgeous and infinitely better than Met Stadium ever was. Met Stadium was kind of a dump, but it was our dump. And, I always say that I was at Citizens Bank Park in Philadelphia the second day for its second game. I wasn't there for the first game ever, but for its second game ever, I happened to be there. And on that second day, it smelled like every ballpark I've ever been at. It smelled like Lysol and hot dogs and
stale beer
on concrete. Absolutely, all that stuff. And it's almost like the new car smell lasts about 10 minutes at these places, and then they all smell like the Met. And the Met, it's just such a it's a smell that instantly brings me back to being 13 years old, and I get that at Target Field as well. So, I'm not against progress. The Met would have been long gone either way. But when they replaced it with the Metrodome, we had a problem.
So my 30 ballpark experience, I don't have Oakland as far down as everyone else does. I hate the Miami place. Speaking of the All-Star game this summer, I mean, that place sucks. I made that number 30 on my list. I put Oakland into like 25 or 26 because it smells like Memorial Stadium. It's like the last place you can go to that is of that era. And when that thing is gone, all of our Met stadiums, all of our old, county stadiums in Cleveland,
right.
They're all Tiger State. They're all gone at that point. So I don't really ever want them to lose Oakland because it has that used car smell.
And Oakland has. This is important. The 72, 73, 74 A's played there. You know, something happened there.
I hated them.
You
It was the
hated
first team I ever hated were the 73 Oakland A's, 74 Oakland. My dad taught me that was the axis of evil, and like Charlie Finley was like, Stalin or something,
Well, but that in itself, they happened, and they were an amazing force in the culture with the white shoes and the mutton chops and Reggie Jackson and the aviator shades and all that. Whether you liked them or hated them, it was an important place in baseball in the 70s, particularly for me growing up in that time when you're 8 years old and you get a Joe Rudy baseball card. I mean, it meant something. And I will say this for the Metrodome: the Twins won 2 World Series there, winning only home games in those World Series, and for all of the horrible days before and after, it was a place where the Twins had their greatest triumphs. And I had this conversation with Kent Herbeck last fall when it was the 25th anniversary of their 1991 World Series win against the Braves, and he had just been to the first Vikings game at now U.S. Bank Stadium, and he said there was not a single shred of evidence that baseball was ever played on that site. And of course not. It's the Vikings Stadium. They can do whatever the hell they want. But I find it somewhat comical and unbelievable that there's a home plate at the Mall of America, but there's no home plate or acknowledgement of Kirby Puckett's Game 6 home run or anything like that at this football stadium. And
they could have at least buried a Homer hanky in there somewhere or something, right?
You would think so. Well, maybe somebody has to do that. Bring a gardening implement to the next game and figure out how to do that.
Steve Rushin joining us here, longtime sports writer at Sports Illustrated. The new book is Stingray Afternoons, a memoir. You can find it anywhere the internet is served. All right, last thing. This is the part where I kiss your butt, and I thank you for coming on because I've always wanted to have you on because I always read your columns. And, I mean, more than anything, like Steph Curry shoots threes, right? Reggie Jackson hits home runs. We can go through everyone's strength. Your gift is the tinkering with language and tinkering with words, and I don't know who's even in second place. I mean, I don't know that it's kind of like Rush. No one else ever really played music the same way they did, so you really can't compare them to anyone. I know you're Steve Rushin, but who's second place? I mean, who did you steal this idea to be so wordy and clever with words? Because I don't see any sports writers doing that anymore.
Well, I have to say, if I'm the Geddy Lee of wordplay, I will take that to my grave and put that on my headstone.
Absolutely, you are.
I don't know if it's a gift so much as an affliction or a genetic disorder or something, but I do know, and it's mentioned in the book, that it's existed since I was a kid. And I would see twins in a headline, and I would see, there's the word win inside twins. Or I remember that the word Vietnam, which was a huge presence when I was a kid, was sometimes spelled one word and sometimes spelled as 2 words. And I thought as a kid that the war had something to do with, uniting or dividing this word rather than this country, at this kind of DMZ of punctuation between Viet and Nam. So it's something that I've always been cursed with, I suppose. And when I was a kid at school, went to the library and found out what a palindrome was, that, this word is the same 4 words as backwards, or this sentence, go hang a salami, I'm a lasagna hog.
Or like Toby Hurrah, right? I mean, Toby Hurrah was the famous when we were a kid, right?
And Jim Otto, who wore a 00 on his back. And, the Radio Center, I would see that Otto on the back in the 00 and think, Otto backwards and forwards, 00s backwards and forwards. My friend Sam Farmer from the LA Times just told me this week that Otto was not 00 for the 2 O's that bookended his name, but it was Otto, AUGHT -OH.
Okay.
And so apparently the center for the Oakland Raiders was better at wordplay than I was because I never figured that out. But I loved that stuff as a kid, and I still do.
Well, hey, man, we love your work. I wish, keep being clever. More on Twitter for me, Steve. I mean, keep giving it to me. Make me laugh, inspire me, and I always appreciate having a great author on. I really have appreciated your time. We're looking forward to reading the book, and I wish you lots of luck. And we're following your career, your lovely wife on television, and all that good stuff. Sports, it's made a pretty good life, right?
It beats working for a living, Nestor. I really appreciate it.
You got it, man. Steve Russian, one of my all-time favorites, joining us here. The book is Sting Ray Afternoons, a memoir. It is out now from Little Brown, and you can follow Steve Russian out on Twitter as well. You can find me out in the Bay, a Toyota Audio Vault, 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from wherever you are. Morning newspaper ships to your email inbox each and every morning at 7 a.m. That's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. If you are on our WNST tech service, you know how good it is. All the breaking news, no spam, no crap. Just breaking news. Ravens and Orioles all summer long. You can get on that by checking on our front page on the left column. And, of course, it's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And Dennis will be here on Thursday driving you home. Much like Mr. Angelos, I am a very available individual. Nasty at WNST.net reaches me. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. And speaking of books, The Peter Principles now out, all 8 chapters from the beginning available online as well as on the audio series. We will be playing that 2 weeks from now when my wife and I take a little downtime for our anniversary. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.